I'll tell you what's a high tariff nation is Canada. Canada charges us 250% for our milk product and other product, and a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such. And yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do. We don't need Canada's lumber.
Major construction firms across the United States have issued an unusually direct and coordinated warning. The American housing market is entering a period of instability unlike anything seen in decades. The source of the disruption is not a dramatic embargo or a headline-grabbing export ban. Canada has not shut its borders to lumber shipments. There has been no single announcement, no sudden policy shock. And yet the impact is already being felt on construction sites from Texas to Ohio to California. The concern centers on one critical reality. Roughly 30 to 35% of all softwood lumber used in American home building originates in Canada. That dependency has existed for decades. What has changed is how Canada is managing, pricing, processing, and distributing that lumber. Through a series of structural adjustments, none of which constitute an outright restriction, Canada has effectively tightened supply, raised costs, and shifted leverage in North America's construction economy. This is not about spectacle, it is about structure. In a typical wood-frame American home, lumber accounts for approximately 20 to 25% of total material costs. When lumber prices rise, the effect is immediate and measurable. Industry estimates show that a 10% increase in lumber prices adds between $8,000 and $15,000 to the cost of building a new house. For families already facing elevated mortgage rates and persistent inflation, that increase is not marginal, it is decisive. It can mean the difference between qualifying for a mortgage or being permanently priced out of ownership. So the question confronting policymakers in Washington is straightforward, but uncomfortable. If Canada has not banned exports, why is there growing anxiety about a construction cost crisis? Is this simply another episode in the long-running softwood lumber trade dispute? Or is it evidence of a deeper shift in how countries deploy resources as strategic instruments in an era shaped by tariffs, environmental regulation, and supply chain realignment? The answer lies in a coordinated transformation taking place north of the border, one that many American officials underestimated. First, production capacity has been reset. Since the peak production year of 2018, Canadian softwood output has declined by roughly 15 to 20%. Aging and less efficient sawmills have been closed or consolidated, particularly in British Columbia. Thousands of forestry jobs disappeared between 2019 and 2025 as companies rationalized operations. On the surface, these closures can be attributed to market cycles, wildfire damage, pest infestations, and cost pressures. Structurally, however, the result is permanent capacity reduction. Fewer mills mean lower baseline output. Lower output tightens supply. Tight supply increases pricing power. Second, domestic prioritization has intensified. Provincial governments have increasingly directed available lumber toward domestic housing programs, infrastructure expansion, and public construction projects. In periods of constrained output, export shipments are no longer automatically prioritized. American buyers are not excluded, but they are no longer guaranteed first access. The shift is subtle, but powerful. It reframes Canadian timber not as an export commodity first, but as a national input supporting domestic economic stability. Third, value-added processing has expanded. Instead of exporting primarily raw dimensional lumber, Canadian producers have invested heavily in engineered wood products such as cross-laminated timber, CLT, glued laminated beams, GLAM, and advanced structural panels. These products command higher margins per cubic meter of wood. They create more domestic employment in processing and fabrication, but they also reduce the volume of basic lumber boards flowing south. From the perspective of American builders who rely on large quantities of affordable framing lumber, this shift tightens availability, even if total export revenue remains stable or grows. Fourth, environmental and carbon standards have raised compliance costs. Canada has embedded carbon accounting, sustainability certification, and traceability requirements across much of its forestry sector. Buyers can still purchase Canadian lumber, but meeting these standards increases production expenses and narrows eligible supply. Environmental policy thus functions as an indirect economic lever. It does not resemble a tariff, yet it alters pricing dynamics in similar ways. Fifth, logistics prioritization compounds the squeeze. Rail networks and ports increasingly allocate capacity to energy exports, critical minerals, and other high-value commodities. Lumber shipments compete within that system and often face scheduling delays and higher transportation costs. Even modest logistical slowdowns can disrupt construction timelines in the United States, where project schedules depend on predictable material flows. Taken together, these measures create a structural choke point. No single policy can be targeted by American trade retaliation. There is no obvious lever for Washington to pull. Instead, the tightening operates across production, domestic allocation, processing, standards, and transportation simultaneously. The consequences for American construction are significant. Builders operate in a thin margin environment shaped by financing costs, labor expenses, and regulatory requirements. When lumber prices become volatile, contractors add risk premiums to protect themselves against further spikes. Even if the immediate increase is manageable, uncertainty alone drives defensive pricing. Delays magnify the problem. A 1-month construction delay can increase total project costs by 5 to 7% due to interest charges, equipment rentals, and labor retention. If material shipments arrive unpredictably, developers must either absorb those losses or pass them on to buyers. Most pass them on. Then comes the expectation cycle. When distributors anticipate future tightening, they secure supply early. Developers pre-order inventory. Wholesalers build stockpiles. The act of anticipating scarcity can generate scarcity. Prices rise not only because supply is lower, but because market participants believe it will be lower. This dynamic spills into politics. Housing affordability has become one of the most potent domestic issues in the United States. Rising home prices push younger families toward long-term renting. Rents increase. Housing's weight in inflation calculations grows. Elevated inflation sustains higher interest rates. Higher rates suppress construction starts. Reduced supply sustains high prices. The cycle reinforces itself. Importantly, Canada benefits from aspects of this restructuring. By exporting more engineered products and fewer raw boards, it captures greater economic value per harvested tree. Higher skilled manufacturing jobs replace some lower margin sawmill employment. Environmental positioning strengthens Canada's reputation in European and Asian markets that prioritize sustainability certification.
This is not merely about revenue. It is about positioning. In an era where tariffs have proven blunt and politically costly, regulatory standards and supply management offer subtler influence. By embedding sustainability requirements and reshaping capacity, Canada transitions from price taker to rule shaper. The United States faces structural constraints in responding. Reimposing or increasing softwood lumber duties has been attempted repeatedly over decades. Such tariffs primarily raise domestic prices without rapidly increasing American supply. Expanding domestic logging faces environmental permitting challenges, legal appeals, and long development timelines. Substituting steel or concrete introduces higher energy costs and exposure to separate global commodity volatility. None of these responses provide immediate relief. The deeper reality is that the American housing market evolved around the assumption of stable Canadian supply. That assumption no longer holds in its previous form. Canada has not weaponized lumber in an overt sense. It has redefined how it participates in the market. For Canadians, the message is domestic value first. For Americans, the message is that proximity does not guarantee priority. For global buyers, the message is conditional reliability. Meet standards and pay market value. Whether this restructuring represents strategic statecraft or rational industrial policy depends on perspective. What is clear is that it exposes an American vulnerability created over decades of cross-border interdependence. The United States did not suddenly become dependent on Canadian lumber, it gradually optimized its housing system around that dependency. Now that system is under strain. The broader implication extends beyond wood. In a global economy shaped by geopolitical competition, climate policy, and supply chain recalibration, resources are no longer neutral commodities, they are instruments of economic positioning. Countries that control key inputs can influence outcomes without dramatic announcements. The American housing sector is discovering how structural shifts, quiet, incremental, and dispersed, can have effects as powerful as any formal trade barrier. And because these shifts are embedded across production, processing, and standards, reversing them would require long-term policy change rather than short-term retaliation. The housing market's fragility, therefore, is not solely about lumber. It is about the risks of concentrated supply chains in an era where national strategy increasingly shapes economic flows. Canada did not create American affordability challenges. High interest rates, zoning restrictions, labor shortages, and inflation were already present. But by tightening a critical input, Canada has amplified those pressures at precisely the moment of maximum sensitivity. This episode may ultimately redefine North American trade assumptions. For decades, integration was treated as automatic and mutually reinforcing. Today, integration is conditional and strategically managed. And in that transition, the humble 2x4 has become far more than a building material. It has become a symbol of how modern economic leverage works, not through sudden shocks, but through deliberate structural evolution that reshapes markets from the inside out.